AWS, and the idea is to create the backend of an application, a full stack web application with just a few clicks on a visual interface. As developers, we love a command line is start from scratch, but I I think this is a nice way to accelerate a web application that has a backend server and easy to work with later on. We will build a fun application, but simple. We will have an API graphic from NoSQL database and authentication. We will talk about the services and features of AWS that are behind these functionalities. And we also learn about Amplify, that is the tool that allows us to do this. So many of you know the web development is always evolving. And for those who are in this area for some years, we've been through several changes. In the beginning of the web, we had static pages HTML with the HTTP protocol, and with CSS, we have a more structure with the JavaScript, Ajax, and jQuery. We start to have the dynamic pages quite similar. Everybody was impressed when we launched the Gmail that we could do everything, send messages without reload the page. Uh, Ruby on Rails facilitated the application creation, generating automatic codes for us. And I put Amazon AC2, but cloud computing helped us. And for us, developers and the companies, to have web applications much easier without buying servers and expecting them to arrive. Smartphones were popular with the jack that we know. We think on apps on browsers. Node made it easier to use the same programming language in the front and back end, and several frameworks of JavaScript also facilitate this evolution. React helped in the composition of our apps, and more recently, the serverless concept with the serverless in the cloud. We can have several features in our applications without being concerned with servers and the operational part. But what do these evolutions mean to us? Well, the responsibilities just increased for those who work in the front end. This is a full stack complete app. We have the credit on the screen, and we go from the back end to the front end. With a GraphQL, we can query data the way we want to render on the page. Now, this is the responsibility of those who work in front. The programming language being the same language we use in the server and in the client. And now it's also responsibility of those working with front. And with the serverless, we can take more care of the back end. So now developers, the front end developers have a broader scope and more responsibility to connect from one end on the interface to the services who are running on in the cloud. And then we have the AWS Amplify. It allows the UI connection with the backend in a very simplified way. And this was the purpose for its creation. It is a set of tools, open source tools. We have these QLi libraries, JavaScript, further Android, and several other frameworks. We have a component Y but it's also AWS services that creates the backend and the host of your application. So it's a set of tools and services. And our demo, I recorded this. I did this step by step, but not to run any risk, I have it pre-recorded. We have this site, sandbox.amplify. You can start your application without the need of having, in principle, an AWS account and go to the end and then to deploy at the AWS, and then you will be required to have an account. Well, but we will have 5 steps here in this application. It's a simple application. It can be expanded later on, but just to give you an overview of what is possible to do. This is the Sandbox Amplify. I'm not logged in my account. I don't have to have an account. And I will start with my data model. The idea is to have a simple application with the recipes I learned during the pandemics. So I'll have a model with name, description, and photos. I can include an optional or compulsory field, and I have the data and show you the relationship between this data. I create comment that people can leave with my recipes. So we have the author and the content. We can add a relationship for the recipes and comments. So one recipe will have several comments. I can change the name of this relationship, and then I click on this yellow but orange button and test my data locally. What is nice in this Amplify Studio, it gives me all the commands necessary. If I don't have, I create a React app, but you have a drop down over there. Then I need to make the pool. Amplify pool is a bitch code. You get the backend configuration we created, all the data scheme, and will bring to my local machine. This intermediary is the instruction to install Amplify CLI, but I do have in my machine. But anyway, this is our scheme, the data we created, and it will download locally. We have the Blackwell scheme. We have the data model also defined. On this is the Amplify folder backend API, and this is the schema where we defined in the beginning. In the Amplify Studio, you can do this manually if you are eager to do so. And we have the source, the models, and index. With this, we can use them in our application. So we have all this code generation starting from a data modeling that we have in a visual tool, and we download it to our machine. What is behind it? We have the data store of Amplify data store that help us to work with offline and online data in a shared and distributed way. And the data source is 2 services of AWS that you don't have to know if you are using Amplify. The first is Appsync, our service of APU, GraphQL, and the other is DynamoDB, uh, highly scalable database. When you create a scheme, it creates the table for the data and the API to have access to everything. The next step, so before deploy or even creating a WAS account, we can test our application locally to see if it is exactly the way we want. So we go to step number 2. Uh, I need you have to install the dependencies, the Amplify library and SmartFit, and that's why I pre-recorded, and now we will configure Amplify in our application in index.js. We will do this Amplify reports and call the Amplify configure. And here in AWS export, we don't have anything yet, but then after APIs and features will be here. So after this, we can test the CRUD of the data we created. So I can select the comments and recipes, and I have all the options, CRUD's options. The first thing is to create a recipe to see if it is working, everything locally. So these are the imports. It tells me the imports I need to do. I will remove this code that I don't need. And now we will create asynchronous functions for the creation of recipes. So I'm getting the data of the recipes from my browser. Do not judge me, but this is the idea to have working faster as possible. So we have name, description, and photo. And on Amplify Studio, they have a snip of codes on how to access a data store to do the persistence of the recipe. I'm not going to use this data. I'm using the recipe we are getting from the prompt, and now we can test it locally and see if it is really working. We log on the additional console of the new recipe, and we'll have a button that we will call this function create recipe. So with the application running, we will fill in these 3 data we asked for each recipe. I put tacos, I think, which is one of my preferred. And this is my recipe with data store, everything in my local machine. And the next step is to list all the recipes I have. So for this, I will use factor react and create a new asynchronous function to the query of these recipes. So please copy this code. It shows here. And instead of logging in the console, I will use set recipes and use effects to call our get recipes function. And now we create a list of all recipes. And for each of them, I will put the name, description, and the photo. So this is the recipe we create in the local data store and locally. When I'm satisfied with my data and the operation of my application, I can go to the next step, which is to deploy to AWS. So everything is okay. The next step is to deploy. And now I'm required to have an AWS account. If I don't have the account, it will take me to the to how to open. I will give a name to my application and select a region. The region, I recommend you to create a region, to choose a region close to your client. This is all the provisioning of the backend using this framework as a code. And when this is ready, I can open Studio when I have a very similar interface to the sandbox we were using and manage my application from here. The data modeling that we created offline that is deployed in the cloud. And I also can manage the management of my recipes and comments here. Instead of adding manually, I can add here. It has an option to generate the date automatically in case I need it, and I can create specific constraints for specific fields. It doesn't work so well for photos because it puts a random URL, but it's an option when you have user or something that is more trivial. So I will create a recipe and I have the option of creating a comment and link it to this recipe. The photos credits are from Flash. Maria is my sister. That's why I put this negative comment. Poor girl. And I created several other data that we can see in our application. Amplify Studio is cool because I can give access to the user that not requiring any AWS account, so we can give access to other people that can come here and manage with the restrictions that we can provide. It's nice for business people who are not experts on what we do. And I showed this. It was launched last year on event and can be used as of the 20th. We put things in public preview, but meanwhile, it's not reliable. Now it is generally available. It's okay to use. And YI library of Amplify allows us to link with the Sigma file, import the components, and bind these components with the data we created here. It's super cool to have this interface of the developers and designers. And we have a template where you can duplicate and work from there. So duplicate the template. You have the primitive that we can use to create our own components, but you have a list of basic components. I will use this one and take this rating price and purchase that does not make sense. And I will change the name of the component for recipe card. I copy this link in my Sigma file and import to Amplify. We give access to Sigma, and now it is importing everything. You have a theme as a design system that we can approve all changes, not initially. Oh, the designer made a change. We can approve the components individually. Since we have TTA 28 that I imported, I will accept all. And now we can find that recipe card that we took out and bind it with our data model of the recipes. We go in configure. I will click on the image and I will say that the image source is the picture of the recipe. The title, I would say it is the name of the recipe. In this text field is the description, and they use all the data that I have created in my content. Here, it also teaches me how to use the components. We need to install this library of the UI Amplify. So everything that it helps us with new feature, it has the snip of the code, the instructions on how it can be used in the application. We also need to configure the UI. I will erase what we have configured before. And finally, we are going to use the Amplify provider in our web app to use the components. Now, to use the components, we need again to do the Amplify pull. The first one was for the sandbox, and now it's for our application that is in the cloud. It will run this authentication and ask data about our application, the editor I'm using, what type of a project, a framework, um, standard commands, and if I want to change my backend or no. Th- Then I don't need to use the application ID. Whenever we have a change, I can use Amplify Pool. We will import our uh, card, the recipe card component. And instead of creating what we were doing, we use only the recipe card. Our key would be the recipe ID, and we have a property of the recipe type. We'll pass this recipe and we'll get the uh, attributes we defined. So here, to be very honest, it was not as different from what I had created, but using our component that we defined on Figma, defined with Amplify Studio, and importing directly the recipe card. This is very cool. I change a Figma file and I sync directly with Amplify. I see the diff of the changes and I can approve or not. Very interesting. And the last part of this demo is to add the data. Amplify give us access to several features, authentication functions, Lambda functions, read editions of machine learning, storage data, many things that we can add. And to close the demo, we will add the authentication part.
Okay. In the authentication menu, there are all the other things that I can also configure. In authentication, I define how we are going to do the login. I can enable the authentication of many elements. I can define attributes that I want the user to give me when they register. I'm going to put the name, the rules for the password, and also the text to check that they can send through email or SMS when they create an account. By adding a new functionality, it's going to deploy it via AWS. And again, I need to have the pool in my machine. But before that, I'm going to add a user manually. I could do this through the app and create a user for myself. And now I copy again the pull command to take the authentication that we don't have locally at this moment. And by finishing that, we are going to see that there is the authentication. It's showing there. And it's not so easy as the date that has the code snippet, but it has how to use Amplify. I can say that I can use the UI component that's ready, and I'm going to import this UI authenticator that is a high order component, and I'm going to leave the app there, and my app now needs authentication to be accessed. So here, this is a login screen using the standard UI from Amplify, and we can change it. It asks you to change the password the first time, the name, if we had some other attributes, and now we need the app that needs authentication to be accessed. So after we add the authentication, we can define that access to specific data to be for by those who create it, or any authenticator user can read, but only the owner can update and remove data. And then we have save and deploy. And the AWS service that's behind the authentication is the Cognito that manages the users and handles the registration or sign up, login. If you forget the password, the multi-factor or to authenticate the email before creating a user, and can also authenticate by other providers and its book. But we don't need to know anything about Cognito. So in our code, we want to use the data. We use the data store. And to us, it doesn't matter if it's web sync or whatever. And to use authentication, we use the authenticator. And I don't need to know anything about Cognito. From now onwards, there are many possibilities. In the manual, I think you could see the Amplify has several other features that we can add. We have the file storage, and we have APIs, OAPA, and Lambda functions, serverless, geolocation, and many other things, notifications, predictions. And the last part of extensibility, we can also use the CDK, use the structure as a code to be able to expand our app that Amplify does not allow us to do, but to manage everything through that point. Oh, okay, now I'm over. So there is a survey. If you want to give me a feedback, I would thank you. And the credit at AWS as a motivation, and to try the Amplify. It has a part of for hosting, and I could send our project to hit hub and link. We already have the backend, and make the link, with the GitHub, and it creates the ICT for the front end, the back end, and it's going to also update the front end of my app. Were you able to get the QR code? And that's it. Thank you very much. You have my Twitter if you want to exchange any ideas. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.